First of all, I'm Frank Gannon, and I was the director of EMBO, but also significantly I was at various stages the scientific director of EMBL was the first thing, and then it became senior scientist and various roles in EMBL that I'll come to later on. But how I got here was circuitous. I did my PhD in England, postdoc in America, postdoc and position in Strasbourg in France, and therefore I was part of the community that were starting doing the recombinant DNA technology, which is the words we used to confuse the population. We're talking about genetic engineering, and we were doing recombinant DNA technology. And by chance, another person who was involved, it was a very small community at the start, in that was Fotis Kavatos. He was in Harvard and he was doing silkworm gene isolation. I was in Strasbourg doing chicken gene isolations because they were the accessible ones. So we knew each other. And then after Strasbourg in '81, I went back to Ireland. I'm very Irish, so I go back to Ireland every twist and turn. And when I went back to Ireland and I was there for a while, in Ireland, there weren't that many who could represent Ireland at the European community level. So the EU programs on various things, I was frequently the Irish representative, and therefore kept contact with all of those who had been in the network of recombinant DNA or early stage molecular biology in terms of mechanism of action. So that meant that I met Fotis frequently. He'd represent Greece, although he was in the States, but he was linked through Crete. I'd represent Ireland. And then in 1993, John Tooze decided that he was going to step down from EMBO. He had been EMBO. It seemed as if he had created and put everything in place. So a very large shadow cast by John Tooze. The interview process was interesting. I in fact was interviewed first of all in London, and then in Paris, Martin Raff, Moshianiv, and then in Heidelberg, I forget who was involved in that, and then in Cologne with Jeff Schell. So the candidate circulated because the committee didn't get together. They gave me the job, and I was nervous because EMBO was a huge, well-organized, big organization, huge reputation. I'd been an EMBO member and proud to be one. And EMBL was even a larger laboratory at a scale and quality that was unsurpassed. So coming in in a key position in that world had me slightly concerned. So I spoke to a friend of mine in Ireland who was not a scientist, and I said, Tommy, I'm not sure that this is going to work out right. He said, well, he didn't say exact word for word what I'm going to say now because it might be recorded, but he said, Frank, it'll take you 5 years before it's known that you've made a mess of it, so don't worry. So the first 5 years will be okay. And there were two things that surprised me. First of all was I hadn't factored in the EMBL was going to be part of my world as well, but John Tooze had been very much involved in EMBL, and therefore I inherited that very much involved role. Almost as a second voice for Fotis, who as I indicated, knew. And in EMBO, it turned out it was just myself and two secretaries, two executive administrative officers that'd be today. So the three of us ran EMBO, which meant all of the courses, all of the workshops, all of the fellowships, all of the short-term fellowships, all of the memberships, the whole lot of it, the three of us did it. And for some reason I had spare time. So I think there's a lesson of either efficiency or overlooking detail, I'm not quite sure which. And Fotis had come in post Leonard Phillipson, and he had had a different experience being in the States and having worked in the States. And there were two aspects that were rather new in his appointment. One was he looked around and saw, well, maybe we should have a PhD program. And the second thing was, shouldn't we be doing commercialization? Oh. And those two aspects I can expand on if you want me to keep talking.
Sure.
Or I can stop and you can ask me something else and I'll get back to it in due course.
I was segueing or thinking of segueing into asking, what did you find when you came? How was the operation? How, you thought you could improve? And, in retrospect, what are you most proud of in the EMBO organization?
Well, there's two aspects. One is, and I should say that my laboratory, I was very pleased to still be active science, and my laboratory was in EMBL, so I was part and parcel of the laboratory world as well. So in EMBO, and I don't think we'll dwell on EMBO because this is EMBL time, but in EMBO, I felt that EMBO could do more, being a prime European organization, and with time, as if you look at it when I left, and as it still is, it had expanded to bring the Young Investigator program in. It brought in Science and Society. It brought in a global program. It brought in strengthening science in the weaker countries. It started having fellows meetings and members meetings and a whole series of engagement with the members, which was much more than had been previous the case. But it was easier perhaps as well. Flights were easier, cheaper and all the rest. But anyway, that was a major aspect. In terms of EMBL, for the PhD program, I wasn't the only one involved in setting that up, but there were some aspects that I believe that I took a lead in. I wanted to have some ceremony for those who finished their PhD at EMBL. Mm-hmm. Previously, when they got a letter from whatever university was the awarder of the degree, and they told 2 or 3 people, and that was it. There was no sense of catharsis and finished, and look what I've done. So Photos was all on for this as well. So we used to have these ceremonies in the Operon, and Photos had his Harvard gown and was handing over a piece of paper and photographs, all of the things that would happen at a graduation ceremony. And that I think was an important aspect, but it tied in also with having members meetings and fellows meetings and YIP meeting, Young Investigator. So that interaction and making them feel like an important group who had achieved something, I think was important.
I certainly remember that because I was a PhD student. So
really?
I had that ceremony, and I remember not only the end, but also the beginning with Fotis, addressing the new kids on the block and saying things like, you are the top future scientist. Yes. And I found this, very inspiring, and it was a lot of also fun to be part of this crowd of great people that really were looking at you for the next step in science. So maybe coming to the science, because you as you were saying, you also had a lab and you were involved with the gene expression regulation, and I guess in those years you were contributing also to the birth of a new field, epigenetics and this kind of regulation.
Yeah, exactly. The scientific aspect, I felt it was important for street credibility. Yeah. That if you're feeling the same pain as everybody else about whatever it was, the paperwork or getting papers in or out or being scooped, I was very enthusiastic that we had, and I had a great team. If you're running an organization, you really need to have a great team, and Steffi Denger and George Reed were cornerstones of that, and then there were others, excellent people who came and went and contributed. We were ambitious, and I think my level of ambition was really pumped up by being in EMBL. We were ambitious to an extent that I couldn't be in Galway in Ireland. Not just because of the means, but just there was nobody would have noticed the difference. Here, you had to be ambitious, because what the heck were you doing in the laboratory in EMBL if you weren't doing really good stuff? And you'd have to give your group leaders talk every year or so, and you had to, people would be looking at you and saying, "God, he's not. That's not serious."
A lot of
peer pressure, but positive in the sense that it drove you to do better. So we started off by. The laboratory was small and therefore couldn't be mega competitive at the global scale, but we picked niche questions. We asked ourselves, how did the estrogen receptor work? So we knew that it bound to close to the promoter, and that then transcription happened. And because we had a good dialogue type of meeting every week, we say, well, why does it stop? Or, what does it happen, and then what happens when that arrow, does it keep going, and yet it doesn't keep going? So we went through a process of evolution, and I was talking to Steffi about it recently. How did we come to the point where we said, well, really what's happening is cyclical. The receptor is binding, and then it's going away, and then it's binding, and when it binds, it switches things on, and then it switches off. And then we said, well, if that's happening, and we're looking at cells growing on a plate, which is what we were working on, they're at different stages in that cycle. So what you're looking at is the average. We just take them all. So we then went in and said, we'll synchronize them. So there are ways of synchronizing, and then release them, and then followed by CHIP, chromatin immunoprecipitation. See what was where, when, and got a timeline on it. And that was, I think that was very good work, and it was very detailed and got well published. And when we did that, and we had this insight that it's unlikely that it was just the estrogen receptor was doing that lots of processes were in fact of that type. And we said, so what do we do next? Because we knew we couldn't compete with the rest of the world. And we said, well, I wonder, we'd seen that the histone modifications were coming on and off. And then we said, I wonder what's happening with the DNA. We just methylated, and we then set that up, synchronized it, and showed that. And that was at the stage where I was moving on to go back to Ireland, as it turns out. So we asked fairly original questions, focused on getting a tight answer to that and knowing our restrictions in what we could do afterwards. Now, all of that was possible at EMBL because the laboratories were terrific. There were skilled people all around the place. The equipment was magnificent. What we needed was there, and financially we were able to get grants to allow things to run for us. So it was the right place. It was really invigorating, and I'd have to say that when I went back to Ireland, it was to run Science Foundation Ireland, which was a funding organisation, and for some reason you couldn't give money to yourself. It's a strange rule, but anyway, you couldn't give money to, so I had to stop my laboratory. But when I started again in Brisbane, I honestly didn't have the same success. I think it didn't work as well, although I knew the right questions to ask, the right people and the right environment, and that's where you really appreciate how good EMBL was, that you could really flourish here.
But you were touching now on 2 points that I wanted to ask you about, because there's a life after EMBO and EMBL, and in your case you were mentioning that you started running at the, I guess, national level in Ireland, a science foundation, which we know is very important to sustain science. So I think, do you have some reflection on that job? My personal opinion with supporting science is that it should be done 10x of what normally government are doing. And you actually have been there in a very critical time because, it was financial crisis, Ireland was hit very hard with that. So maybe, I don't know if I'm touching something sensitive, but if you have some thoughts about that,
there's
it
no
would
sensitivity
be great.
in it. It's a different career. Yeah. Well, if you're running, so Science Foundation Ireland was the funding agency. It was, the government set up a fund in Ireland because it needed to get more research done. Ireland needed to upgrade its skill base to make it attractive for pharmaceutical or IT companies or whatever. So a very deliberate plan that we're going to increase the amount of research that's going on in Ireland. When we looked at it, at the start of that plan, which is I think 10 years while I got there. At the start of the plan, Ireland was publishing less per capita than Bangladesh.
Oh.
So it was not a great sales pitch for sophisticated companies to come. And they had come because it was cheap labor, and then the labor became less cheap, and then they moved to wherever they're going to make fruit of the loom elsewhere in the world. Yeah. So it was an important strategic decision to set that up. But it also accepted that the criterion had to be excellence, not simply relevant to the industries, because they were clever enough, these faceless civil servant types, to know that what we needed were people who were trained at the highest level. So it invested money to bring scientists in, to give them good resources, to set them up and to grow their activity. So I walked into when that was ongoing, and at the same time it was just when the financial crisis. It's a funny thing that in Australia they call it the global financial crisis, the GFC. It was very local in Ireland. And there was this, oh my gosh moment when you say, oh, is it going to really get that bad? So the budget for SFI, Science Foundation Ireland, was supposed to increase by 30% per annum, which was a lot of headroom for bringing in new projects or continuing things. And then suddenly it was 3%.
Okay.
And I said, this is, now am I in a wind down mode? Is it my job now to end science in Ireland? And I fought really hard with the government about that. And that was an education in itself, to have to deal with the government directly on behalf of the community you believed in, but not as their spokesperson, but just because you believed in the concept of it, and try to convince the government that they shouldn't cut. And I remember the Minister for Finance, I met him at one event, and I said, I've been trying to meet you, Minister. He said, I know that, Frank, I know that. And he said, well, I've been very busy, you may have noticed. I said, yeah. So we were in this photo opportunity for opening a data center. And he was beside me. I said, well, can we talk now? And so he said, yeah, go ahead. So I said, Minister, you believe this is going to end at some stage? I do, yes. When it come out of it, we're going to have science, because otherwise we won't be attractive for anything. So therefore, please don't think of ending, or that it's a luxury, it's a necessity. And he did give me a comment which I cannot say on air because it was full of rude words, which more or less says, why do you scientists think you're so special? But he put in a few words along the way. Having said that, and having given me the message, clear off, when it came to the budget, the one line that wasn't cut was SFI.
That's good.
It didn't increase, but it wasn't cut.
Yeah.
And I'd already said that I was leaving because I wasn't sure what was going to happen. It became very depressing, like daily bad news does your head in. And Australia gave me an opportunity to go elsewhere. So, but living that, you could see also the pressure that the politicians were under. Like he was literally deciding between having a bed in a hospital or a PhD student or a postdoc. And,
I can imagine.
And there's more
difficult.
votes over here than over here.
Yeah.
And they have to be very wise, brave, the good ones. And they also have to work so hard. Like those poor guys and gals, they were at everything, morning, noon, and night. They all had to turn up with an understanding of what's happening. And so it was a huge education about the other side. And also how unrealistic scientists are when they say, why don't they give me more money to do what I want to do?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that people learn is really the perspective of the global issues, in which science is a tiny bit. However, it's a very important bit for an economy.
But there's another interesting part in that, and that's the transition from support of basic research. Remember I said at the start that they want to just support excellence. That was fine. But then they said, well, it would be good if we could do more. So I set up a census of all of the people who got funded by SFI. It wasn't a big deal to do so, and said, where are your students going, what's happening with them, how much you publish, how much money, a few statistics on that. But also, are you working with industry? Do you have any contact with industry? Although you were given your job because you're an excellent scientist in quantum computing or whatever. And I was astounded and pleased that 2/3 of them were working with industry, voluntarily, just because it was a community where that would happen easily, a smallish community. You'd inevitably meet opportunities where the industry to learn something about wasn't their next product, but the one beyond that. So that was a good answer to those who say, well, why are you supporting basic research? Well, industry is interested in it, whether you're not.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And I guess, then you transition to another job where probably there was a lot of this work to be done, because you got the opportunity to start an institute from scratch, and as I understand it is partly a medical relevant institute.
No,
so
actually,
I
didn't start it from scratch.
Oh, okay.
It was set up in the 40s by the Queen, Australia, this is in Australia, in Brisbane. And there are states in Australia, and Queensland is one of the states, and New South Wales and Victoria and South. So in Queensland, they felt that the government wasn't doing enough for the diseases which were more tropical back in the 40s. And they set up the Queensland Institute of Medical Research. Now, why I might have thought it was a new one is because it's now called QIMR Berghofer. And that's because I had a very successful series of meetings and got very friendly with, went to rugby games with a great philanthropist who gave 60 million to QIMR, and then it became QIMR Berghofer. QIMR had previously got about 50 million from an Irish philanthropist, Chuck Feeney, who came, this is before my time, he used to go, he played tennis with Ken Fletcher, who used to play tennis in Wimbledon and all the rest of it. And Ken Fletcher had brought him to Brisbane. He thought it was a nice place, he thought he'd support something. He was a billionaire and he gave money to QIMR. So there was it existed. The interesting challenge coming into an existing place, which I'm sure is the same as FOTUS and every new head of EMBL faces as well. Okay, this is what was going there. Where can it go? More or less your question. And so I found structures evolve, and if you stand and look at them and say, how did you end up like that? So I repackaged it in different ways, put much more emphasis on translation. I think because of my time in Ireland, I became very aware that we needed to have an answer to the question, what are you doing for society? And it didn't have to be, crudely applied research at all, as I pointed out earlier, but you did need to have some answer to that. And so we built up much more medical translation into the hospital area and to the other hospitals in the place. Again, the commercial side, I had started on that when I was in EMBL because FOTUS was keen on saw in America the biotech industry and said, well, what's happening here? I remember a discussion in the canteen up here. I said something with some of the senior colleagues and they said, we don't need to do this. We don't need to do this. I said, you do, because the delegates who are supporting you are doing it in all of their countries, and they'll be saying, why aren't you doing something that's, if there's an opportunity? If there's not, you don't force it, but if there's not. So I brought that along in EMBL first, when that's where Emblem got set up, and I was involved in setting up a company from our work as well. So there was some real experience, and the same then I brought to QIMR Berghofer. But learning how things work in a new country, like coming to EMBL, learning how it works, that's always a resetting. You don't know an awful lot of things.
I guess it keeps you young. But I mean, we sort of came full circle because we came back to MBL and EMBO. So I wanted to ask you, if you were to get on the EMBO post today, I mean, what do you think would be the problems and the areas, the opportunities also, and the areas where we can even develop this mission of, your part was very instrumental in building, better training, better exchanges with society. So what would be the areas that you see today are important?
Well, I think there's a commonality around the world at the moment is the problem of early career researchers. The need to attract people into science and to retain them there is more demanding now than it was in our time. I write articles still for EMBO Reports, and I wrote one recently about generation precarious, because people correctly ask, well, why am I doing this? I'm the sharpest in my class, the best in my university, I'm publishing papers and I can't get a real job. Shouldn't I? And if they don't say it, their partner say, well, if you're that smart, why can't you get a real job? And by real job, I mean something that has some modicum of security about it. And I think that EMBO and EMBL both are in a position to focus on that delicate community. And perhaps, I'm not saying to ignore the bosses and the heads of group leaders. They've got their worlds worked out, and they have to be very good. But to ensure that the people who are at the more delicate stage, where they're not set up, they don't know where they're going to end up, they know they're going to have to leave from EMBL, they don't know what they're going to go back to, they don't know what their funding is, can they get a mortgage? All of those questions are big pressures that are felt more profoundly now because our material expectations are greater. Like there was a time when you would. So I think there's a commonality in that. I think the Young Investigator Program is an example of doing that. I think taking good care of postdocs, which is the fellowship program about training people for that, and recognizing that there's a diversity of outcomes, that you can, 10% might end up being like the laboratory they're in, and the rest will have to find something fulfilling. Yeah. So that is one angle. Second angle, I think, is that we really can't have a real pyramid of there's some countries that are terrific at science, and then there's less and less and less and less and less and less, and then it's very poor. That's not good for the very smart people in those places, and it's not good for the collective. You're going to need all of them. So I think we have to work on the peripheral or the lower performing countries. And when I was setting up the installation grants in EMBO, we had an interesting discussion about how do you define a country that's poor performing. And I came up with the equation, well, how about if we had all of those countries that were paying more the government was investing less than the average in research. And so GERD being the gross expenditure in R&D, so if it's lower than that, then you can work out that money is needed to do research, less money is less research, and all the rest. But the list of countries was a little bit embarrassing because it wasn't quite as one might have anticipated.
Italy being probably one of those.
I didn't want to say that, but they were the person who said, do you realize, and I said, oh gee, this doesn't match the image or the quality of Italian science.
Sure. No, but I mean,
but something like that is needed. So I think really that, and I think then the community interaction is essential, and we just cannot live in our little cocoon, that because society is looking for the answers, but it also is looking for honest answers. And the honest answers are sometimes harder to give. In other words, when will you cure this? And you say, well, I don't know.
Well, I mean, there's plenty of questions that, I could go on and asking, because you've been instrumental also in setting up the ERC, in starting EMBO reports and journals. So maybe next time we will have a longer discussion with publishing and other aspects that I really wanted to ask you about. But for now, I really thank you for this interview. This has been a great discussion that we
Can
had.
I just say one thing? I'm glad you mentioned the ERC, because that was a huge success, and it needed an organization with some oomph to say, why don't we do this? And EMBO got up and said, why don't we do this? I remember writing in an editorial, NIH for Europe or something like that, I called it, because it seemed timely to bring that aspect in to complement the other things that the EU is doing. And that will continue.
Yeah, and actually I think this could be the springboard also for structuring even more European science, because of course that's top programs, but as you were signaling, there's a lot of countries that are in a position where it's very difficult to access.
And I in fact proposed more than once that there should be, see it like the soccer, you've got the European Champions League, and then you have the Europa League, and you have the conference or whatever, and by competing with those who are at the same level as you, you do get better, and you move from being and you get better and better.
Yeah, so many things to discuss at the next time. For now, thank you so much.